Let me tell you about a cold, bright Saturday in the fall of 1974 at the Renfro estate auction on a ridge farm 2 miles outside Hindman in Knott County in the eastern hills of Kentucky. If you have never stood at a hill country auction, picture a mud yard behind a leaning farmhouse, tables of dead people's things dragged out into the light, chipped dishes and mason jars and rusted hand tools laid out on blankets in the grass. The air smells like wood smoke and wet leaves, and the coffee somebody is selling out of a big steel urn on a truck tailgate. It is the kind of place where a thing is worth whatever the loudest man in a good coat says it is worth, and where nobody expects to be surprised. Now, into that yard, a little before 9 in the morning, walked a woman named Della Whitcomb. Della was 61 years old that fall. She had buried her husband Emmett 2 winters before, and she had come the 7 miles down off her own ridge in a truck that coughed the whole way, alone, with a cloth coin purse in her coat pocket that held not quite $4 in it. She did not come for the dishes. She did not come for the tools. She walked the tables slow, the way you walk when you are looking for one particular thing, and you will know it when your hands find it. Here is what you need to understand about that crowd. There were maybe 40 people scattered across the yard that morning, and most of them fell into 2 kinds. There were the neighbors, hill people who had known the Renfros all their lives and came partly to buy, and mostly to say goodbye to a family that was gone now. And then there were the pickers, men who drove up from the towns and the cities to buy cheap and sell dear. Men who could put a price on a thing in the time it took to glance at it. And of the pickers that day, the one who mattered was a man named Roy Tandy. Roy was 54 years old, an antiques dealer out of Lexington, and he had a shop on a good street there with a green awning and a brass bell on the door. He had been buying out dead people's houses for 30 years, and he was good at it. He wore a camel hair coat that had never seen a barn, and he moved through that yard the way a heron moves through a shallows, slow and certain. And every so often his hand would dart down and pick a thing up, and the price of it would be settled in his head before he set it back down. When Roy Tandy saw Della Whitcomb walking the tables in her dead husband's canvas coat, he did not see a rival. He saw a hill widow killing a Saturday, and he was not wrong about much, but he was wrong about that. Now, off at the end of the last table, half under a horse blanket, sat a battered cedar chest. It was about the size of a feed trough, the lid split along one board and mended once with a strip of tin. The whole thing gone gray as a fence post. Somebody had already lifted the lid and looked inside and let it fall shut again, because what was in there was cloth, old cloth, folded and packed and pressed down under 30 years of its own weight, faded along the top folds to the color of a dish rag. To nearly every eye in that yard, that trunk held rags, cleaning rags, quilt scraps somebody's grandmother never got around to throwing out. Della Whitcomb stood in front of that cedar trunk for a long time. She lifted the lid and set it back gently against the table so it would not fall. She did not dig. She reached in with 2 fingers and lifted the top fold of the topmost piece, just an inch, just enough to see the back of the stitching, and she held it up to the light coming low across the ridge. And she looked at it the way you would look at a letter in a hand you thought you would never see again. Then she laid it back exactly the way it had been, and she stepped away, and her face did not change at all. And that was the thing. Her face did not change at all. The auctioneer that morning was a man named Verlin Sizemore, who had been calling farm sales in 3 counties for 20-odd years, and could sell a broke shovel to the man who broke it. When he came down the line of tables and got to that cedar trunk, he flipped the lid up with one hand, looked in, wrinkled his nose, and let it drop. And here is exactly what he said. The words Della would repeat herself more than once in the years after. He put his hands on his hips and he called out to the yard, "Well, folks, here's a old cedar box full of somebody's rags. Might be a use in the chest if you can stand the smell. We'll get to it by and by." A few people laughed. It was not a mean laugh exactly. It was the easy laugh of people who had already decided a thing was nothing and who were glad to have their minds made up for them so early in the morning. Roy Tandy laughed along with the rest, and he made a little note on nothing in his head and moved on down to a pie safe he actually wanted. And Della Whitcomb stood at the back of the crowd, quiet, her coin purse in her pocket, and she waited, because in that yard on that morning, everybody was sure they knew what was in that trunk. And there was exactly one person standing in the grass who knew they were wrong, and she was not saying a word about it yet. Here is something worth knowing about country auctions, and it has stayed true for a long time. At a farm or estate sale, small goods are often sold as what auctioneers call box lots or trunk lots. The whole container and its contents together for a single bid, sight barely seen. Buyers judge them in seconds, by the top layer alone, and move on. It is how a great many overlooked things pass for pennies, because the person selling has no time to sort, and the people buying have no reason to look deeper than the lid. Now and then, what sits at the bottom of a box lot is worth many times the price of the room it's sold in. Now, to understand how Della Whitcomb could stand in that muddy yard and know something 40 other people had already decided was nothing, you have to go back a long way, and you have to let me tell you about a woman named Naomi Combs, because this story does not really start at the Renfro auction. It starts 50 years before that, in a front room heated by a coal stove, on a ridge 2 hollows over, where Naomi Combs kept a quilting frame hung from the ceiling on 4 ropes and lowered it down over the laps of any woman who came to sit and work. Naomi Combs ran the quilting circle at the Free Will Church at Hindman for the better part of 40 years. She had come into the hills as a young married woman around the turn of the century, and somewhere along the way, quilts became the thing she gave her whole mind to. Not just the making of them, though she could piece a top nobody could fault. What Naomi cared about was the history sewn into them. She wanted to know who made a quilt, and when, and where the cloth had come from, and what the pattern was called on this ridge as opposed to the next one over, where they might call the very same pattern by a different name. And here is the part that matters most. Naomi Combs kept a ledger. It was a tall, black-covered account book she had bought secondhand. And starting sometime around 1912, she began writing down every quilt she could get her hands on to study. She would sit with a quilt across her knees and she would write, in a small slanting hand, the pattern name. The maker, if anyone living could still say it. The year as near as she could pin it. And the fabrics, the dyes, the little tells that let her date a piece to within a few years even when nobody remembered a thing about it. Indigo blues and the strong reds they called turkey red. The browns and tans that came out of madder root. The way a cheap dye of a certain decade would fade to a certain particular tan and no other. Over 60 years she filled most of that ledger. It was, though nobody in those hills would have used the word, a museum written down in a single book. Now Della was a girl of about 8 when she first began going to Naomi's house. And she went the way children go, sent along with her mother on a winter afternoon and told to sit still and be no trouble. But Della was not the sort to sit still. She drifted to the frame, and Naomi, instead of shooing her off, handed her a threaded needle and showed her where to put it. "Small stitches, honey," Naomi would say. "You want them small, and you want them even. A quilt lasts as long as the worst stitch in it, no longer." And Della learned. She learned across a great many winters, from 8 years old to a grown married woman, sitting under that hanging frame with the older women, until she could feel the difference between a quilt made to keep a body warm and a quilt made to say something, and she could tell them apart in the dark with just her fingertips. But more than the stitching, Naomi taught Della to read cloth the way you read a page. She would lay a piece across the girl's knees and quiz her. "How old, Della? Don't guess. Look, what's that blue? Where's it fade to? Feel the weave. Now tell me a year." And little by little, over the seasons, Della got so she could hold a scrap of forgotten cloth and tell you the decade it was printed, the same as a farmer can tell you the year by the ring in a stump. It was not magic. It was 30 years of a patient woman handing her one quilt at a time and refusing to let her guess. Naomi Combs died in the spring of 1958, when Della was a woman of 45. She had no children of her own living. And when the small things were parceled out among the church women, it turned out Naomi had left careful word about the ledger. The black account book was to go to Della Whitcomb and to nobody else. Inside the front cover, in that same small slanting hand, Naomi had written a single line for her to find. It said, "Read the stitches, and you will never be lonesome." That was all. Not an explanation, not an instruction on what to do with any of it. Just those words, waiting on the flyleaf. And for the 16 years between that spring and the Renfro auction, Della read that ledger the way some people read scripture. She read it at her kitchen table by lamplight after Emmett had gone to bed. She read it in the years he was sick, and she read it in the 2 winters after he was gone, when the house was too quiet, and the ledger was company. She came to know every page of it. And somewhere in those pages, written in Naomi's hand around 1920, was an entry that Della had read so many times she could say it with her eyes shut. It described a set of quilts, album quilts, Naomi called them. The kind where each block is a different picture worked in applique, cut cloth laid down and stitched in fine, and where the women who made them signed their blocks. According to Naomi's ledger, in the 1850s, a circle of women up at the head of Ball's Fork, led by a renowned needlewoman named Lavinia Sparks, had made a small number of these album quilts as gifts and had inked and stitched their own names and the date into the borders. Naomi had seen one of them as a young woman and never forgotten it, and she had written it all down, the pattern of each block, the names in the border, the year, everything, and then added a last line by herself. "Lost now," Naomi had written. "Gone to some trunk or some grave, a shame." So you see, when Della Whitcomb lifted that 1 inch of folded cloth in the Renfro yard and held it to the low fall light, she was not looking at rags, and she was not guessing. She was reading a page she had known by heart for 16 years, and the page was reading back. Here is something worth knowing about old quilts. You can often date one within a decade or two without any record at all, if you know how to look. The dyes are a calendar, certain blues, certain browns. The bright red they called turkey red, and the way particular cheap dyes fade or even eat through the cloth over time, all belong to certain stretches of years. Add the pattern, the batting, the thread, and the width of the loom the backing came off of, and a trained eye can place a quilt in its time as surely as rings place a tree. Now let me take you back to that muddy yard, because it was getting on toward 11 o'clock, and Verlin Sizemore was working his way down the last row of tables at a good clip. He had already sold the pie safe to Roy Tandy for $11, and a churn, and a box of horseshoes, and a Bible with a family tree in the front that a Renfro cousin bought back for $2 and carried off pressed against her chest. And then he came to the cedar trunk with the split lid, and he flipped it open one more time, and he made his face, and he got started. All right, Verlon said. "We got this here cedar chest. Needs a little work, and whatever rags is in it, they go with it. We ain't sorting. Who'll give me $1? $1 for the box. $1 to start." Now, here is a thing about auctioneers. They can read a crowd, and Verlin could read that this trunk was a mood killer, a thing to move past quick so as not to lose the rhythm of the sale. Nobody raised a hand. "$1, he said again. "Somebody give me $1. It's a good stout box." And still nothing. Over by the pie safe, Roy Tandy glanced at the trunk. And you need to understand that Roy actually looked, because Roy looked at everything. But he looked the way a man looks who already knows the answer. He saw a broke cedar chest worth maybe $4 if the lid were sound, which it was not. And he saw a pack of moldy cloth on top of it that would cost him money to haul off. He gave the smallest shake of his head, the kind a dealer gives to tell an auctioneer he is out before he was ever in, and he turned back to arranging his winnings. Rag weight is what Roy would have called that trunk. Not worth the gas. "Half $1, Verlon said, dropping it because he wanted the box gone. 50 cents and the box is worth that in kindling. And that was when a voice came from the back of the crowd, quiet but plain, so that people turned to find it. $2, said Della Whitcomb. There was a little pause. The kind of pause where 40 people decide all at once whether a thing is funny. Verlon Sizemore looked up, a bit surprised, and then he grinned, because a bid over the ask is a gift to an auctioneer and he was not going to question it. $2. The lady in the back says $2. God love her. $2 once. $2 twice. He looked around, more for show than anything. Nobody was going to fight a widow for a box of rags. Sold. $2 to the lady in the canvas coat. And the gavel, which was really just a wood block he smacked on the table, came down, and somebody laughed, then somebody else. It ran around that yard like water finding the low spots. That soft, pitying laughter that people let out when they think they have just watched a lonely old woman throw away $2 she likely could not spare. A man near the front said, "Not quiet enough. Reckon she needed the rags." And Roy Tandy, over by his pie safe, smiled to himself and shook his head, and thought, the way he would put it years later, "There's a sad thing. Somebody ought to drive her home." Della paid her $2 to the clerk at the card table, a girl with a cash box and a ledger of her own, and she got a scrap of paper for a receipt. And then she walked over to that cedar trunk, and she did not drag it off to her truck. She knelt down in front of it in the wet grass, in her dead husband's coat, and she lifted the lid and leaned it back against the table. And then slowly, with both hands, the way you would lift a sleeping child, she drew out the topmost quilt and stood and let it unfold down its length toward the ground. Picture it the way the people close enough to see it saw it. It was an album quilt, a field of white-gone soft ivory with age, and across it, block by block, were pictures worked in cloth, a basket of flowers, a little house, a wreath, a bird on a branch, its wing laid down in a blue so deep it had not faded in 120 years, because it was good indigo, and good indigo does not quit. The laughter did not stop all at once. It sort of thinned out, the way a crowd goes quiet when it slowly understands it is looking at something it does not have the words for. Della turned the bottom border to the light. And there, stitched in fine thread and inked in a hand gone brown as strong tea, were names. She read them out, not loud, but in the new silence everybody heard her. Lavinia Sparks, she read. Dosha Combs, Rachel Sparks, Elmira Fields, and then a date worked into the corner in the same brown thread. 18 and 54, Della said, and she folded the border back over her arm, gentle, and she looked up at all those faces, and she said, "There's 7 more like it under this one. These were made by the Balls Fork women, up above Hindman, the year before the war fever started. They were thought lost. My friend Naomi wrote them down in a book 50 years ago, and grieved over losing them. And they were in a box under a horse blanket the whole time. Now picture that yard, because this is the moment it turned. It was not the quiet of a dead sale. It was the quiet of 30 or 40 hill people, some of them named Combs and Sparks and Fields themselves, understanding all at once that the box of rags held the handwork of their own great-grandmothers, signed in their own family names. An old man took his hat off. A woman started to cry without seeming to know she was doing it. And Roy Tandy set down the thing he was holding, and he came across that gravel yard slow, and he stood in front of Della Whitcomb, and he looked at that quilt for a long minute without saying anything at all. Then he put out his hand. "Ma'am," he said, "I have been buying and selling old things for 30 years, and I walked past that box twice this morning. I don't know how you knew, but you knew, and I didn't, and I'd be a fool not to say so." And Della Whitcomb shifted the quilt to her left arm and shook Roy Tandy's hand. And that was the first time, though it would not be the last. Here is something worth knowing about these quilts. In the 1800s, women made what are called friendship or album quilts, where each block is a separate design, and the makers sign their work, sometimes in ink, sometimes stitched. They were given as gifts of memory to a bride, to a family moving west, to a departing preacher, to a collector or a historian. A signed and dated quilt is worth far more than an unsigned one, because it is not only a beautiful object but a record, a roll of real names in a fixed year, a page of history you can put your hands on. Now, a thing can be true in a muddy yard and still have to be proven at a kitchen table. And Della Whitcomb knew that better than anybody. She hauled that cedar trunk home in the coughing truck, and she carried the quilts into her front room one at a time. And she laid them out on clean sheets on the floor, all 8 of them. And she got down Naomi's black ledger and opened it to the page she knew by heart. And she went block by block, name by name, quilt by quilt, matching what was stitched into the borders against what Naomi had written down more than 50 years before. Lavinia Sparks was there. Dosha Combs was there. The little house, the wreath, the bird with the indigo wing, all just as Naomi had described. Every quilt in that trunk matched the record. There was no luck left in it by the time Della closed the ledger. There was only proof. Word travels in the hills the way water travels, slow along the surface and then everywhere at once underground. Within a month, people knew. And in the spring of 1975, a man drove up from a museum in Louisville, a soft-spoken fellow with cotton gloves in his pocket, and spent a whole afternoon on his knees on her front room floor. When he stood up, he told her plainly that a signed, dated set of 8 album quilts from before the war, all made by one identified circle of women and still together, was a thing he had never once seen in 20 years of the work. A collector he knew would pay real money for even one of them. He was kind about the number, but the number he said would have paid off Della's ridge and bought her a new truck besides. Della thanked him for coming. She gave him coffee, and she told him no. She told a picker from Cincinnati no that summer, and a lady from a fancy shop in Nashville no that fall. And over the years, she told a great many people no, some offering sums that would make your eyes water. She never sold a single quilt out of that trunk, not one. She would let them be shown, in time. She loaned them to the County Historical Society for a display one summer, and stood by the case all day telling whose great-grandmother had made which block. But sell one, and let it go off to hang on some stranger's wall as a pretty thing with no name attached, that she would not do. After a while, people stopped asking, because they understood it was not a price she was holding out for. It was not for sale the way the sun is not for sale. And here is the thing that grew out of that trunk. The part most worth sitting with. Word got around those hollows that Della Whitcomb was the woman who knew, who could look at your grandmother's old quilt and tell you who made it, and when and whether it ought to be kept. People started coming up her ridge, not to buy and not to sell, but to bring her quilts that had nowhere else to go. A quilt found in a smokehouse. A quilt a family could not agree on and did not want thrown out. Orphaned quilts, she called them. And she took everyone and read it and wrote it into a ledger of her own. A new black book kept the way Naomi had kept hers, so the names would not be lost a second time. Roy Tandy was part of that too, which is the piece that always lands hardest. Roy, who bought cheap and sold dear for a living, who had walked past that trunk twice. He started stopping his car when he saw a quilt in a box lot at a sale. And instead of flipping it to a city shop, he would drive it up Della's ridge and leave it on her porch. The dealer had turned into a rescuer, one quilt at a time, and never once asked her for a nickel back. Let me tell you about the last time those two talked, because it is the part that stays. It was the fall of 1989, 15 years after the Renfro sale. Roy Tandy was 69 by then, and closing up his shop for good, and he drove up the ridge to say goodbye. They sat on Della's porch with coffee and talked about the ones who were gone. And when he got up to leave, Roy held onto her hand a beat longer than he needed to. And he said, "Della, I got to tell you something that's been on me a long while. That day at the Renfro place when you read out them names, I shook your hand. But I want you to know, in my heart, I figured you'd got lucky. I figured you'd heard some story about them quilts, and it happened to be that box. It took me a few years to understand you didn't get lucky at all." And Della Whitcomb looked out at her ridge for a moment, and then she said the thing folks have carried ever since. And she said it plain, the way she said everything. "Roy," she said, "them women sat up in the cold and put their names in cloth so somebody down the years would know they'd been here. Everybody in that yard saw $2 of rags. I saw the hands. And you don't sell hands, Roy. You keep them, and you say the names out loud so nobody's ever really gone. That's the whole of it. That's all Naomi ever taught me." Roy Tandy nodded and did not try to add anything to it, which was wise of him. He got in his car and drove down the ridge, and that was the last good long talk they had. For he passed the next winter. Della Whitcomb kept those quilts the rest of her life, and when her own time came, she left them, all 8, still together, to the county. With the ledgers, both ledgers, Naomi's and her own, so the names would go with the cloth and never be parted from it again. And if you were to walk into her front room on a clear afternoon, even now, you would find her quilting frame lowered down on its 4 ropes the way Naomi's used to hang, and spread across it, the album quilt with the bird on it, the indigo wing still not faded, turned so the low light comes across the bottom border. And stitched along that border in thread gone the color of weak tea are 7 names in a year. And folded over the rail of the frame, open to a page, sits a black account book. And on its flyleaf, in a small slanting hand, 4 words. Read the stitches, honey. Here is one last thing worth knowing, and it is a practical one. Old textiles are fragile in ways that surprise people. Direct sunlight fades and rots the fibers, so quilts should be kept out of it. Folding a quilt the same way for years cuts creases that never come out. So collectors refold along new lines now and again and store them flat or loosely rolled, wrapped in unbleached cotton or acid-free paper, never in plastic, which traps damp. And across the country, volunteers run quilt documentation days, recording the maker, the date, and the story of family quilts, so the names are not lost the way Naomi feared they would be.